Hello, Byzantine history students. Greeting once again from the Shack of Knowledge in the wilds of northern Minnesota. Today, I'd like to give you the last lecture prior to us meeting again next Wednesday. On Wednesday, I would like to discuss the entirety of the Crusades as much as humanly possible. So, read chapter 12. We're now finally up to the chapter 12 that I had so ambitiously assigned for prior to the Thanksgiving break. Read up through chapter 12, and it wouldn't hurt to get a bit into chapter 13 as well, because the aftermath of the sack of Constantinople in 1204 is a major issue that has everything to do with this strange phenomenon of the Crusades. When we last left our beloved empire, it was in crisis due to the leisure classes resting on their laurels after the reign of Basil II, and the conditions were those of a debased currency, military crisis, and at the very time that the Seljuk Turks are expanding, the military is gutted by Constantine IX. Constantine X forces things to continue much faster with the debasing of the currency, which I talked about a bit. I'd like to talk about how this is wrapped up by the Komneni. We had briefly discussed the coming of Alexios I, the first of the Komneni emperors. I want to talk about that tonight and how this gets us to the very edge of this phenomenon of the Crusades. There's no question the Seljuks were a threat, but having rambled their way into Byzantine territory and all across the former Byzantine heartland, what we call Asia Minor, the area known as Turkey today, they were not in the best position to keep attacking, especially since the next major move would be the area around Constantinople itself, and there had been no luck. There had been no luck conquering Constantinople in the past. So Alexios Komneni comes to power and is facing a number of serious problems, two in particular that I want to talk about. If we're going to cast this the right way, we have to recognize Alexios for what he was, which is an extremely capable leader and the representative of a group of military individuals who had rather woken up to the problems that were facing the empire. Largely due to a combination of the skill and daring of Komnenos, as well as fortune, Byzantium did not cease to exist as a result of its own folly of the late 11th century. That's not a terribly ambitious way to put it now, is it? The best that Alexios did with all of his brilliance and cunning was prevent his empire from being wiped off the face of the map. For a bit more than a century, they would recover from, or to be a bit more pessimistic about it, which I think is probably also a bit more accurate, they would stave off a twofold threat of collapse. The first threat was economic. We'll talk about this quite a bit more in a bit. The crisis caused by the debasing of the currency. Now, when you add to that the loss of resources, well, why'd they lose resources? Because all of the grain areas and wealth-producing areas of Asia Minor were now in the hands of the Seljuk Turks. Moreover, vassal states in the Balkans had rebelled, which they tended to do when they suspected Constantinople was full of people who had no sense of political timing and less of an understanding of protecting their vassal states. So the vassal states rebel and go it alone. The resulting spiraling inflation we have to consider again, which comes from a debased currency. This would have been in place by the accession of Alexios I, as best we can tell. There are no good records. There's no, stock report of Constantinople in the 11th century. But we do have a sense that Alexios comes to the power because others had realized what his uncle had realized before. The crisis is severe. Romanos IV also was aware of this, as were the rebellious generals under Constantine X, Maniakes and Tornakis. The other crisis is military. Manzikert was far more of a failure of Byzantium than a defeat. Think about the distinction I'm making there. It's not so much that Byzantium was defeated as Byzantium failed to do what it should have done at Manzikert with a force of 200,000 people. Romanus IV could not prosecute a war when his allies would freely betray him, running away and turning on him, and his own people were far more interested in their agendas than in defending the realm. The Turks had it fairly easy, to be honest. Byzantium was too busy fighting itself to put up a good front and fight them. By 1081, the collapse of the empire was a possibility perhaps better recognized by the West, that was starting to rub its hands together in a certain amount of glee, thinking that their trading rival, and now, from the Pope's angle, the heretics of the East, would have their comeuppance. The others who recognized that the potential fall of the empire was at hand was a handful of military families who in the 10 years since Manzikert had woken up and realized, wow, we are on the edge of complete annihilation. These families had come to run the Byzantine military. They were a military aristocracy. We'll talk on them a bit more, but Gregory uses the term, and so will I. The court and the city leaders of Constantinople seemed blissfully ignorant of what the military, facing down the military threat particularly, was fully aware of. The crisis had come to a head. We will look at each of the factors in turn above, the economic and the military. I'll give 2 slides to each one here. But we need to consider first what Alexios Komnenos truly was. Certainly he's an emperor. But a page has been turned in Byzantium with the crisis that precipitated his rise to power in the late 11th century. He was the representative of the military families. He was a representative of a group, something of an alliance of upper scale military governors who decided they needed one of their own to run the empire, and for once they agreed that it should be pick somebody capable, and that somebody was Alexios. After Alexios became emperor, he did not really govern as an autocrat the way some emperors prior had. In fact, most emperors had an autocratic bent to their administration. The only ones who didn't were the ones who shared rule with either a trusted advisor or a not so trusted wife or a distant relative or an adopted co-emperor, this type of thing. So the idea that power was held by the throne is no longer operating the way it always had been. Power is held by the aristocracy. Power is held by a small group of people who perform a military coup in order to rule jointly and prevent further decline. And it was an emergency move. Their dedication to the greater cause of the empire, though it may have come from sheer fear of losing everything that they were and had and owned and loved, their dedication to the idea of empire meant that they bought stability for a time. They were willing to set personal issues aside. The chaos after Manzikert really was a wake-up call to a number of the main military families that were willing to fight in the endless civil wars under Michael VII. They started to see the daylight. Was it too late? Only a gamble like this could prevent it from being so. Their military focus meant that the Byzantine government at all levels was dominated by the army. This was a military government. Sparta, the communist dictatorships of which we are familiar with their uniformed bureaucrats. The bureaucrats of Byzantium were perhaps not quite so thoroughly military, but they were all military at this point. The military ran the show. and the government was restructured, as Gregory points out, to fit this new ideal. The old offices are simply wiped out and replaced with new titles, which don't have a lot of meaning, but are covering for the basic fact that the military runs everything. To be an officer is to be a politician and to have political power. It is a rather benevolent, by comparison with what we think of, a rather benevolent police state in modern terms. You don't have, the mail-clad, jackbooted thugs running down the streets in order to maintain order at all times. Order was maintained mostly by the fact that there was no further reason for disorder. So it's under Alexios, there are relatively few internal dissensions after the very first years of his reign. The time has come, the walrus said, to talk of many things. Oh, that's a brilliant poem, but let's talk about the economy. This subject, unfortunately, bores far too many people. If we'd pay a little more attention to how economies actually worked in the last 3 to 10,000 years of human history, we might be able to apply some of the wisdom of the past to what's going on now. You know from my last lecture that I am generally skeptical of the economic direction of America. This is not because I'm a Democrat, not because I'm a Republican, because I am neither. It is because I'm a historian. And I have never seen the type of crisis that we are inventing for ourselves turn out well. And I have seen, studying history, a great many examples of it. So let's look at the Byzantine economy, and you apply it whatever way you want. But please pardon me if I can't avoid making a few comments along the way about what disturbs me in the modern Republic of America. Historically, when we study all the times that this has occurred, the crisis brought by a debased currency, what the Fed calls money pumping, the invention of value for the money, debasing the currency tends to lead in two directions. And of course, it was easier to debase currency when it was made of a precious metal. You'd just reduce the value of the metal. One direction is consolidation of power in the hands of those who use their increasing power to reestablish the economy. Diocletian handles his debased currency this way, by being the complete autocrat, by shoving the Senate aside and saying, "Let me fix this." He does. He's harsh, he's cruel, he leads to the downfall and death of many people. But in the end, Constantine I can inherit an economy which has gone a long way toward being right side up again. The coinage has value, and the empire is coming back in trade. The fact that many thousands of people died along the way is an unfortunate footnote as far as Diocletian and Constantine went. The conditions in the Byzantine world do not permit the type of harsh measures that Constantine takes, or that Diocletian and Constantine take, but there are similar harsh measures which must be considered, and we will. The second thing that can happen when the value of a state economy disappears, when the money becomes worth less and less until it's perhaps worth less. Yeah, think about it. That made sense. Until it's worthless. Is that the state economy breaks up because it can no longer hold together as a single state economy. This is happening rapidly in the European Union as we speak. Watch the BBC. It's got a lot to offer. These local economies have separated in order to better their chances by going it alone. Now, to be perfectly honest, some of them separated to better their chances by going alone, those that could succeed. And perhaps, of course I could be wrong, it's just that in human history it's never happened otherwise, perhaps the EU will stay together and make it through. Perhaps economies like Greece will be shoved aside because they are not self-supporting, they're a complete mess. Spain, Italy, perhaps Ireland may follow. They're not alone either. But the ones that will break off and either form a new confederation or go it alone, places like Britain, France, Germany, these groups are typical of what we see in the crisis of a debased currency, and certainly the euro has been debased along with the American dollar, but for, I would argue, slightly different reasons, global market realities aside. So it means when a large economy breaks into smaller local economies, that the locales in Byzantium, the themes, which were capable of self-sufficiency, did quite well. And that is something to keep your eye on. But it also means that the weaker local economies, places like Greece in relation to the European Union, the weaker local economies suffered and were often taken over militarily or by colonization. So they became the victims, or the prey, if we want to put it in Darwinian terms, of the stronger individual economies. It's really Malthus as much as Darwin. In the 12th century in Byzantium, we will see both. The first thing that occurs after the debasing of the currency, after the economic crisis of the money being worth something in the Byzantine world, but next to nothing outside of the Byzantine world, the first thing we see is a tyrannical, if benevolent again, consolidation of power by the military aristocracy under Alexios. So, you have step one. Somebody seizes power who is going to, by force and with a great deal of pain for his people, fix the problem. This doesn't last, however. Economically, it may not last after the death of Alexios. It's hard to say because, again, we don't have the tax records and we don't have the market reports that give us a clear view of what's going on in America today. So, sometime after Alexios, and prior to the destruction of the empire in the Fourth Crusade, the devolving of the economy into stronger and weaker local players occurs. These, and this is critical for understanding why the Fourth Crusade can get away with what it does, these local players are not paying taxes anymore, either because they are weak local economies and just don't have the money to meet the draconian tax demands of the government, or they are strong local economies that can blow off the request of an increasingly desperate central government to reel in the taxes. Someone has to enforce the tax laws, and this is a tough thing when the country's already broke. Wonder what you could do. The Fourth Crusade, then, which includes the sacking of Constantinople and the real breakup of the empire for the first time, it falls for, I would argue, the second time in 1453. The first fall is 1204. The Fourth Crusade, though, has as much to do with the weakening of Byzantium internally as it did with outside agendas and the aggression of certain members of the West. I don't want to diminish outside agendas or an aggressive Western Europe in what happened in 1204, but the reason any of that could succeed was that Byzantium had already largely destroyed itself or fractured itself economically. This will become clear, and I think my thesis will gain an awful lot of support when we look at exactly how the empire fell apart after 1204. It falls apart, here's a foretaste, into local divisions that are economically stable locally. My argument is those local divisions simply existed before, and the Crusaders carved up the empire according to the stronger and weaker states that had already developed within a fractured Byzantium. In the meantime, the military families formed a desperate alliance in order to halt the conquest of Byzantine lands and reestablish the economy. They're given something of a reprieve in this because the Seljuk Turks have largely run out of military steam and are frankly just enjoying themselves in control of Asia Minor. Hey, that was heck of a battle of Manzikert, wasn't it? Wow, we've got this whole chunk of land. Rich, good farmland, some gold mines. What could be better? Let's just hold off on Constantinople for a while. So the reluctance of the Seljuk Turks to press their conquest also gave a little bit of time, but they kept moving. A battle here, a battle there, a few raids into Byzantine territory, testing the strength of the defenses. The military alliance knew that the great battles would soon come. So Alexios follows the example of Diocletian in both the military and economic crisis, and he reestablishes the currency by force, and he also takes to the battlefield. The economy, part 2. This is where we see Alexios taking some drastic measures in order to fix a desperate situation. And it's only drastic measures that will fix a debased currency. In order to reestablish the value of a currency, assuming that that currency has a metal base, may even be made of metal, gold coins, if you have a gold standard or a silver standard, if the currency is metal-based, the government must gain control of a tremendous amount of that metal. In order to reestablish the value of a coin, to put more gold into the coin, you have to have the gold to work with. Basic idea. So the first thing that Alexios does, under the idea that you may have to continue to inject poison into the system before the system can start recovering, an old alchemical theory of medicine, if you like. He continued to debase the currency. Now, that seems like it's counterintuitive. If this is what's killing the economy, why would you continue to do it? In this case, it's part of a draconian measure to fix things in the end. Maybe it's close to a chemotherapy. You got to kill off the cancer, even if it does an awful lot of damage, and then you hope what's left, with a little help from medicine, will recover. What it means, if he continues to put less gold into the coins being sent out, is that the coins going out of the central government would be less in value than the coins coming in. So every time you bring in coins, you get a little more gold than you're putting out. The end result is that you start amassing, through heavy taxation, if you're willing to do so, you start amassing an awful lot of the very metal you need to restore the value of your coinage. So the next thing he does, in order to ensure that he would get more gold coming in than going out, is that he raised taxes considerably, and he expanded the system of tax farming, because he doesn't have the money to support a massive IRS, and the IRS system wouldn't have worked for him at all. But what tax farming is, Gregory's mentioned a couple of times, an individual could purchase or be awarded the right to collect local taxes while keeping a portion of those taxes for himself, for personal use, before passing the rest back to the government. So basically, local warlords and thugs rise. Sometimes they're nice people, but they're nice people who are willing to hurt you badly if you don't pay your taxes. Local warlords and thugs and nice people who are willing to hurt you badly are going around the countryside gathering in as much revenue as they can because they get something out of it. Comes short of a complete social collapse, but just. The other thing that he does is develop new taxes that are exorbitant. Everything gets taxed. As much money as possible needs to come back into the central government for the government to reestablish the currency. At the same time, when it was possible, he didn't just use effectively confiscatory taxation, he confiscated gold outright. If there was the possibility of taking over any gold that's floating out there, the emperor seized it. What this meant particularly, any gold that's not in the possession of the emperor was a potential target for his seizure. This meant melting down church vessels. The gold plate and the medallions and the various accoutrements which had been given by pious individuals to the church and were seen as part of the common treasury. But it also meant moving against anyone who might have a dubious legal standing in relation to the regime. and taking their stuff through the power of law, or allowing them to pay hefty fines. Okay, you have the choice. We've deemed that your house, which really should have become part of the military complex in your local city long ago, your house should be torn down brick by brick and used for a military practice ground. So go away. We're taking it. This is the eminent domain idea, if you're familiar with American law. Of course, Byzantine law didn't have the bar on eminent domain abuse, which is what's going on right now in Alexios I's reign. You seem to have lost a court case against the empire some generations ago, and never fully paid the penalty. So we'll move against your property now. The law books are being combed, and the records are being combed for any way to take people's stuff. And if there's a legitimate claim to seizing their property, that claim would be pressed, and you would lose your property. After all, you're dealing with a military government here. What are you going to do? They're going to take your stuff. On the other hand, it's a benevolent military government, so using a strategy that King Henry VII of England would use a few hundred years later, he offered them a way out. If you don't want us just to take your farm or to take your property and turn it over to the military or whatever's necessary for the survival of the state, we'll allow you to pay enough money that you can keep it. A sudden way out appears before you, but it means coughing up all the gold you have in order to keep your property. So this is another way of pulling in revenue. The result of heavy taxes, draconian taxes really, is that by 1092, 11 years into the reign of Alexios, there were many rich families who had been reduced to poor families. No clear evidence was seen even at the time of this being revenge-oriented or punitive. It simply was what the state was doing in order to reestablish itself. Many poor families, by the same process of taxation and seizure, were reduced to a type of living, subsistence living, where you have to basically eat what you grow and live off your own resources, because you're not going to make a profit in the end. It's a break-even, day-to-day existence. And a great many citizens were aware of what was going on and were angry over the loss of the public possessions of the church. You see, the church is too often treated by Western thinkers as if it's a bunch of greedy clergy that control everything. Well, the greedy clergy were there, and the greedy clergy tended to have an awful lot of power. There were also plenty of non-greedy clergy and seriously dedicated clergy. But the stuff of the church, the material of the church, was regarded by the citizens quite correctly as their common property. If, for instance, there is a gold curtain in Hagia Sophia, the cathedral in Constantinople, and this curtain is woven with gold thread, the people didn't think of that as the church's curtain. They thought of it as their curtain, because this was their church. They were the people who made up the church. And this concept of the church consisting of the very people who attend it is strong in the Byzantine mind. So when the church property is seized, when a gold communion vessel is removed and returned with, just lost a log off the fire, and replaced with a gold-plated or a much lighter communion vessel so that it could still be used, or a nice polished brass or bronze communion vessel, the people know that their stuff's been taken. Alexios is replacing it with something that's serviceable, but it no longer is the possession of the common people of Byzantium. So this is what's going on. People are angry, people are frustrated, people are poor, fortunes have been wiped out, people have been turfed out of their lands, but they aren't being slaughtered, and from the military aristocracy's point of view, that's the whole point. There were a handful, of course, who had become either much wealthier or at least maintained themselves. These are the tax farmers, the local heads of the of the tax-gathering syndicates, and Alexius was ready in that year, 1092, to produce a new coin, the hyperperon, which would reestablish foreign respect for Byzantine trade. It came up to almost the same weight as the old solidus, and it would stabilize the internal economy. It was a little bit lighter than the old solidus. While necessary, this process, this government imposition, this government control, the confiscation of people's stuff, the ruining of people's lives, careers, and livelihoods, this would also contribute to the phenomenon of local economies going their own way by the end of the 12th century. In other words, the moment the government in Byzantium can no longer enforce its confiscatory economic policies, people simply are going to stop paying. And that indeed happens. Turning to the questions of the second half of the crisis, the military, whatever the debased currency meant for individuals in the Byzantine Empire, the threat to the outside justified the policies according to the military aristocracy of this type of confiscation. There were, in fact, many throughout the empire who were aware that the purpose of the confiscatory taxes and the outright seizure of property by Alexios was to rebuild the military and prevent the empire from being completely overrun by eastern tribes, the Seljuks, and the West. They knew there was a threat there. Many of them were fully aware that their neighbors and friends and family in Asia Minor now had a new governing class, and they weren't particularly keen on changing governments, if you will, just yet. Alexios was beset with foreign aggressors from the moment he took the throne. The Balkans had devolved into local kingdoms dominated by Serbs, Armenians, certain Bulgar warlords, and the new wave from the east. There's always somebody coming down through the steppe corridor, as it's called, and this new group is the Patzinats, or Pechenegs, as they're also called. Asia Minor saw a steady erosion of imperial holdings at the hands of the Seljuk Turks. They weren't pushing their advantage too far, as I'd mentioned, but they were keen on taking what they could when they could, and they were equally willing to buy any political influence in Constantinople using flat-out gold to do so, and incite civil war if possible. What the military alliance that formed the military aristocracy did, in effect, was ensure that by allying with each other, they wouldn't be turned on each other easily by a Seljuk plot. Most immediately, the Normans in Italy under Robert Guiscard were ready to invade the weakened empire in 1081, under the pretext that since Guiscard's daughter had married the son of Michael VII, he was invading to restore the old and rightful dynasty. This was, as Gregory puts it, a dubious claim at best. Nobody is really keen on going back to the glory days of Michael VII, since the glory days were a low-grade civil war and economic collapse. So there's not a whole lot of support for that one. But Guiscard has at least a pretext for going to war, and it seems to make sense to do so if the empire is weak enough. The Normans had to be dealt with immediately and directly, so Alexius went to war, using the proceeds from his first forced confiscation of church property to do so. He doesn't have much of a force. He has to go to war in the very first months of his reign to fight off Guiscard's invasion of his own territory. Alexios initially then had very little to work with, but in 1082 he managed to buy the Venetians and their navy, and that was the biggest thing. They now had a fleet of ships with which to attack Norman interests in the Mediterranean. He was able to buy the Venetians over through a treaty which gave them tax-free trade rights throughout the empire, and it also gave them an immediate gift of cash. The Venetians, for their part, hated the Normans, which was very much to the advantage of Alexios, and they saw the advantage. If they could trade anywhere in the empire without being taxed, oh boy, with a group of people who are themselves taxed so heavily, the Venetians realized they would be the local duty-free shop wherever they showed up, and knew they would make a killing off the Byzantine Empire. So they were more than happy to go to war against the hated Normans if this was the reward. They also got, because Alexios was desperate, an immediate lump sum of cash. You do what you have to do. It certainly worked, but this would cost a great deal more than Alexios realized. The lost revenue to the Venetian traders and the role that Venice would eventually play in the downfall of Constantinople in 1204 were set up by this very treaty in some way. Although most of the battles that he fought against the Norman invaders he was defeated in technically, he was defeated in a way where he cost the Normans so many lives that they had to rethink their position. The Normans had not expected to see what they saw. They thought Byzantine emperors were weak, they were non-military. Byzantine emperors wouldn't take the field, and if they did, as at Manzikert, they wouldn't have the support of their followers. You could divide and conquer. It would be a fairly easy deal, thought Guiscard, to push in and take over the Byzantine Empire. That's why it didn't matter that his claim to being part of the old dynasty was bogus. When the Normans lost so many lives in their victories, they had to think about what their resources would actually be in the future. So Alexios, very short-manned, very under-supported in resources. Alexios could basically get beaten, but get beaten in such a way that he cost the Normans dear, and the Normans decided that they couldn't pull this one off. After the Venetian alliance particularly, Guiscard started tallying up his odds and realized he had an awful lot of things to do back home. Oh man, it's been so long since I've seen the wife and kids in Italy. Probably ought to head back there and make sure things are okay. So he hightailed it back to Italy and decided that this was not worth doing at the time. As Gregory points out, however, later Normans would renew the effort when the empire had a far less capable set of leaders, and this would be a different story. The military part 2. The sudden departure of the Normans had bought Alexios a little bit of time to deal with his other problems. His economic policies bought him alliances with old Balkan neighbors and better quality mercenaries. The Norman example showed anyone else who might revolt that they would have a tough time because Alexios himself was a general and knew what he was doing. Now, as the money started rolling in, which was seized from his people, he could bribe and pay off some of the old Balkan alliances, support Serbia here, some of the Bulgar warlords there. The Armenians could use a few new public works projects. A little bit of money goes a long way with Armenia if you're going to keep them on your side. So the other thing that they see is he's able to pull in a much higher quality mercenary because he's paying quite well now. More importantly, and this is key to understanding Alexios' thinking, he's not going to try to run this show with an overbalance of mercenaries. Because the tax system is so harsh under Alexios, this meant that the native military joining the Byzantine army itself, remember the option to buy off your title, your commission, and get out of the military early, was offered by previous emperors in the 11th century. Now the situation's reversed. Now there's a premium. You can avoid some of the harsher taxes, and you can gain some of the better money to be had by entering the military, particularly particularly as a heavy cavalryman, what's called a knight in the West. So these cavalry officers are recruited from among those who see the economic advantage of working for the government, and that would be the class of people who could afford the arms and armor. Gregory talks about that as being significant. But they would also be able then to hire retainers, also with no particular tax on the monetary transactions involved. These people could hire retainers, so there could be infantry willing to follow the cavalry, and you suddenly have an economic policy which is so bad that people are willing to join the military to ensure that they have the best possible economic fortune. This, and there is a sense of genuine nationalism developing in Byzantium. The word nationalism is always an anachronism prior to the 18th and 19th centuries, but the sense that we are going to have to fight for ourselves, and Alexios is the type of leader we can follow. You read Alexios' daughter Anna's description of her father's bravery fighting off 3 French knights personally. They had lances, he had just his sword and light armor, and he did quite well. This reputation was not limited to his daughter by any means. He was good when it came to fighting, and that's the type of fellow who can, in the days of sword and shield, that's the type of fellow who can draw quite a following. This then was a genuine wartime economy. The resources of the empire are being poured into restaffing the military, and it eventually produced a native force strong enough to keep the mercenaries and the allies in line. When mercenaries are fighting next to a native force that is not bought off, that is fighting for their own homeland, and is highly trained, the mercenaries tend not to do what they did at Manzikert and just run away. They'd be killed. They'd be followed and slaughtered by the stronger native force if they pulled that off. Meanwhile, the native force would hold off, the enemy at a battle line until they'd bothered punishing the miscreants who took off. So this was a fairly typical thing that a mercenary had to face and think about. But this also meant that allies like Serbia, all that Alexios has to do is show up with a few thousand of the new military in tow and say, "Hey, I'm paying a visit to you. How things going, neighbor?" Serbia says they're going well. Glad you visited. Glad you demonstrated that you're strong again. Don't expect a revolt from Serbia in the near future. We understand that things are coming back in Constantinople. Good for you. Now we have to talk a bit about this whole Byzantine Confederacy, because you have an image of empire which has very little to do with anything but an invented idea of the 20th century. Empires do not necessarily expand. Empires do not necessarily control things autocratically. An empire simply has a single head of state, an emperor, that runs the show. So the Byzantine Empire is made up of a central kind of controlling government in Constantinople and an awful lot of allied states that had a great deal of autonomy, in fact, complete autonomy in many cases, but thought of themselves nonetheless as subject to and allied with the Byzantine world. They thought of themselves as Byzantines. They were just from another kingdom. This is a confederacy. It's not a federal situation. I don't know how to avoid a lecture on the concept of confederacy. It gets into weird ideas about the southern states and the Civil War and all kinds of stuff like that. But when a group of states shares a common interest and a common cultural identity and yet is free to make their choices on fighting or not fighting, has a great deal more autonomy than we're used to states having in the United States. This is a confederal situation. So the client states such as Serbia, Albania, and Russia, and there were numerous smaller members, they saw themselves as genuine members of the Byzantine cultural, economic, and religious world. They were, however, a genuine confederacy of partner states, and while attached to the empire, their military assistance was not a guarantee. They could choose to act in their own interests and not support the empire in a war, say, off in Asia Minor at Manzikert, where the Serbian troops expect there's going to be a failure. So there's no guarantee that the Allies are going to go to war together. They may sit this out and see themselves as the salvation of future Byzantium, and that's indeed what Russia becomes. They pick up the mantle of fallen Constantinople after 1453. Let Dr. Pogorelskin fill in those details in another course. They were free then to act in their own best interests. They weren't forced to do anything by Constantinople. When the Byzantine home military was strong, as Alexios was making it, this meant they had ready allies. There are a lot of people who are willing to be on the winning side if you're leading the battle. And Serbia and the Russians and the Bulgars are willing to help with this. When it was weak, it meant potential rivals for the seat of military power and even warfare. This is what was going on with the various Bulgar revolts. The Bulgars were not trying to break away from Constantinople. They were trying to be seen as the true emperors of the Byzantine world. The power of Constantinople declines, the power of the Bulgars rises under Simeon, for instance. And then again, this is what happens in Russia. The power of Constantinople declines, so this means that Moscow, or Kiev, Novgorod, not Moscow, not for a long time yet, that Novgorod, Kiev, are the true powers of the Byzantine Confederacy. Lost one of the members, unfortunately it was the member that started the whole show, but Byzantium's not gone. The empire's not gone, which is why the Russian Tsars, the Russian Caesars, see themselves as the extension of what was going on in Constantinople. The Balkans had moved towards strengthening their home rule during the decline after Basil II. Can't trust Constantinople anymore. They're busy living the good life and squabbling among each other, so Serbia, Albania stake their own claims and strengthen their own home governing system. As Alexios was still building his own military, a crisis almost prevents him, not really prohibits, but prevents him from succeeding with his Balkan gamble. The Patzinaks, the latecomers through the steppe corridor, who had not become really firm clients of the empire, they were off and on allies, but they hadn't established a relationship like, say, Serbia. They attacked Constantinople and formed an alliance with the Turks, who were supposed to attack from the other side. This was exactly the crisis that Alexios didn't need, but he did know how to handle. Constantinople is under siege from 1090 to early 1091. At this point, from within the walls, Alexios made a geographically strategic alliance with a tribe called the Cumans in the Balkans. He led his army out to wipe out the Patzinaks at a battle at Mount Lavunion. The Cumans, for their part, simply put pressure on the backside. This pincher move had been used time and time again in Byzantine history for the defeat of the Bulgars, particularly this catch your enemies with an enemy of their own on the other side was strategically valuable. Alexios' next step was to bring the Slavs and related peoples back to a coalition with Constantinople. And certainly the defeat of the Patzinaks did an awful lot towards suggesting that a real military emperor was back in charge in the seat of power. This complete recovery of the old alliances was cut short, however, because the Cumans, his own allies against the Patzinaks, were not particularly attached to the Byzantine ideal itself, and they revolted. It wasn't a major revolt or a devastating revolt, but it was still demonstrated that Alexios could not exercise complete control over client states, and so a complete consolidation of the Balkans was short-circuited with that. Nevertheless, the image of Alexios as a strong leader had impressed the Serbs, had impressed the Russians and others enough that some military support could be expected. So, in 1092 through 1096, Alexios is busy reestablishing his power. The Seljuk threat, the Turkish threat, remains. They had been content to work with the Patzinaks and to bide their time, but Alexios was convinced, as was the entire military aristocracy, that in time the Turks would attack again, and this time could be the last time, one way or the other. The military and economic crises, which we have discussed in the previous slides, really set the stage for what we now call the Crusades. Among the many strategies used by Alexios to strengthen his military leverage, and he was smart in doing so, was the attempt to gain mercenaries and allies from much farther away than the Mediterranean basin. It was a bright move. It was shrewd. Bring in people from far enough away that they would not be tempted to turn on the Byzantines, and let them go home, when they were done fighting for the Byzantines, well paid, after having fought some mutual enemies, such as the Mediterranean Normans. This is really quite smart. The Pope doesn't like the Normans. The Pope feels threatened by the Normans. Write to the Pope and say, you know, we could use a little pressure on the Normans from your end. If you know any local warlords who can put pressure on southern Italy, you may encourage them to do so, your All Holiness. If you yourself could suggest a little bit of displeasure with the Normans and concern over their spiritual well-being because of their behavior, we'd appreciate it, your All Holiness. Hey, over in France, could you send anybody? We'll pay them well to fight on this end. We got a lot of enemies, and we have a recently strengthened economy. We have a wartime economy. We pay soldiers well. Know any soldiers who might want to come and be paid well so they can take Byzantine gold back to France? Hint, hint. This is a pretty clever idea. Meanwhile, you can fight people that you don't like particularly well anyway, the southern Normans. Trapping enemies between allies had worked many times before, and it certainly worked with a little gamble with the Patzinaks, that having the Cumans on their backside was enough to allow Alexios to wipe them out from the front. And the use of mercenaries from far distant lands, such as the Russian Varangian Guard, was also very sound policy. And this goes all the way back to the foundations of the old empire under Augustus Claudius Vespasian. If you send people to fight in Britain, and you don't have enough of your regular legion to fight, hire some people from Syria. They'll have no love for the local British people. They won't share a language or a culture or an awful lot that could suggest they would switch sides on you. But they will fight, they will take your money, and they will do a good job. More recently, the Russian Varangian Guard, after 988, was a group of very good Viking, essentially, mercenaries who fought for the Emperor of Constantinople and indeed formed a large portion of the Emperor's household guard. They both were well paid and thought of themselves as the natural allies of Constantinople, since they were part of the Confederation, and their loyalty to their own emperor, the Russian Tsar, gave them a sense of extended loyalty to the emperor in Constantinople. From Alexios's point of view, the letters he sent out sometime in the 1090s were probably a fairly minor part of his policy. Boy, wouldn't it be nice if the Pope, even though we're having our difficulties right now between East and West, if the Pope would step up to the plate and tell some of his subjects, particularly Norman subjects, that they need to rethink their spiritual well-being. Attacking Byzantium might not be the best thing before the throne of Christ to explain on the last day. Sure, if you can have that help, good. If you can have a few contingents of French who are willing to come take a little bit of gold and kill a lot of Normans, well done. If they're willing to fight off the Turks, even better. Even better, because now you have the chance to build a force that can see both a defense of a Christian country and a reasonable profit as the results of their labor. And that's how Alexios has framed it. He had not reckoned on what the West had become in the last century or so. Alexios dealt with Western leaders as if they were the same type of client states that he dealt with Serbia or Russia or anybody else. They just weren't his client states. But they would act in their own best interests, and he wrote letters suggesting that they do so and promising that Byzantium would pay them well for it. He had not realized that the sense of consolidation in the West, of kingdoms unifying and growing, also led to a sense of Western self-importance. They'd heard rumors that Byzantium was on its last legs. Now letters come suggesting that Byzantium could use some help from the West. We're powerful to offer more than a little help, in quotation marks, thank you very much. We're powerful enough to send some pretty major military assistance. But once we're there, will Byzantium be strong enough to prevent us from doing what we want to, or need to, do to secure our best interests? Many of the local kingdoms of the old Germanic tribes had consolidated power as proto-nations and could field fairly large forces through the feudal system of mutual obligations that had developed. The papacy had also expanded and consolidated its power over Western Europe, and it's safe to say that I don't think Alexios understood the type of power that the Pope actually wielded. He thought of him as much as a patriarch. You can influence the people, but he hadn't realized that the Pope could also control large sections of the population with his very unilateral influence. The papacy now wielded unprecedented influence over the hearts and the sentiments of those tribes who had come to think of themselves as the true Christendom. You see, once they got on their feet after the 10th century or so, the Western European nations, or proto-nations, the Western European developing kingdoms, really thought they were Christendom. They had the true vicar of Christ on earth, as he had proclaimed himself. They had the Pope on their side. They had the true inheritance of empire through Charlemagne, and they were the true heart and soul of Christendom. This would absolutely puzzle a Byzantine thinker, a Byzantine general citizen, if they'd heard what the West actually thought of themselves. They were Christendom? They're a bunch of backward tribes. They are the true power? They don't even have an empire, not a real one. They have a bunch of feudal fiefdoms. That's not very sophisticated. The Pope is the single true vicar of Christ on earth? Really? The Pope is one of 5 original patriarchs of all Christianity, and the East has the other 4. The Pope is one, if one of the most honored and the most honored voice among the patriarchs, but when the Pope is wrong, the other patriarchs have the right to make their own decisions, which is how they understood the kerfuffle in 1054. The West had changed. The West had a very different view. And we need to probably talk about this more on Wednesday, because this is such a foreign concept that I'm trying to present to you. Finally, Alexios had underestimated the conviction on the part of the Pope and the Western Church leaders generally that the Eastern Christians were guilty of schism and heresy for excommunicating the representatives of the papacy who had excommunicated them, not being obedient to the Pope. And the East is wondering, why would we be? He's never been our Pope, he's your Pope. He's Rome's Pope. Alexandria has a Pope. Jerusalem has a patriarch. We have a patriarch. Heck, even Bulgaria now has a patriarch. So does Serbia. The East doesn't understand that the West thinks disobedience to the Pope is a sin, is evidence of heretical tendencies, and is clearly an act on the part of the East of breaking away, of rebellion. The East is puzzled. We haven't rebelled against anybody. We simply didn't put up with a barbarian demand that we bend the knee to some patriarch in Rome who can't even speak Greek. These are deep issues, and they're issues that must be kept on the table. Please ask me about them. You need to understand the difference between East and West on this one. What finally arrived in Constantinople in the autumn of 1096 was both shocking and overwhelming to the natives. A huge force of people who had come supposedly for a religious war, and yet Byzantium always was sure. The people, the emperors, the governing elites, the person on the street, they were always sure that they couldn't be serious about a religious war. There's nothing religious about war. That's a bizarre concept. You might use your religion to encourage people to fight in defense of their homeland. That's just being honest. God doesn't want Byzantium to be wiped out. We're good people. We don't want to be suffering under some foreign ruler. But to go to war because of religion, that is a foreign concept in the history of Christianity. It certainly has no resonance at all with the East. They're convinced, and I think, if we're going to be honest, we might have to agree with them to an extent. Although there were people who fought a holy war on the side of the Crusaders, what was behind it from the Eastern point of view was mostly a land grab. Let's see what happens in the Crusades. Do they go and fight and die for a holy cause? Or do they seize property and keep it, property such as Edessa and Jerusalem and Acre? They very much do the latter. That suggests that religion is not the purpose of the Crusades. It is a pretext. That's the Byzantine answer, and I think that balancing that against the religious war idea is going to bring us closer to the truth of what actually happened than what actually we've been told in textbooks previously. I want to bring up a related concept just to give some weight to my argument. Remember, history is about evidence and interpretation. What I want to throw out is one of the Crusades that didn't go to the Holy Land. Crusade could mean a lot of different things. There was a crusade which was sent to northeastern Europe, particularly the Baltic area. And this was the crusade led by the German Order of the Sword. The Order of the Sword got to the regions we think of as Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia in the 11th century. And, of course, they were there to convert all the pagans that still hadn't been converted to either Western or Eastern Christianity. What did they do when they got there? They fought, they set up colonies, and most of their effort, according to the records that we have of the Order of the Sword, of the Baltic Crusade, are records of trade. They are records of economic sheets, income, expenses. There's very little discussion of converting the natives at all. The natives do convert for usually the usual reasons. It's to their advantage, and some of them start believing the stuff that is very, very sparsely being preached in the wake of the Order of the Sword. That crusade was about economics and the expansion of the economic sphere, which would eventually be called the Hanseatic League. Crusade? Not really. Not in the standard definition. And I would suggest that the Crusades in the so-called Holy Land aren't much of that either. How they behave, the treaties they make, they're willing to make treaties with the Seljuks or with Constantinople as they will. This suggests that at least the leaders of the Crusaders are not particularly there to save their souls. Needless to say, then, at this point in the course, the Eastern Christian understanding of the so-called Crusades is very different from what the West still maintains about the nature and motives of the Crusades, good or bad. Initially, the West would insist that this was done for religious reasons and the defense of Europe, fair enough. Now we condemn the Crusades as Christian violence. Fair enough. Christians were being violent, and that is technically against their religion. If you look at early Christianity or take my early Christianity course, you'll see how that was. But this is not a particularly accurate way to approach the problem. The West maintains one thing: for good, we're defending Christendom, or ill, look at the West beating up on non-Western nations. What's missing is the actual events of the Crusades, where you see crusaders not wantonly slaughtering people any more than they wantonly slaughtered people in every battle. That's what battles are about. Hell, Basil II blinded 14,000 Bulgarians. That was merciful compared to what usually happened to prisoners of war and to conquered lands, at least right after the conquest. This is a violent time. Oh, as opposed to now, where well, I'll let you fill in the blank as you see fit. So, what actually occurs in the Crusades, the evidence. The Crusaders come, they establish kingdoms. They don't fight for Byzantium. They establish their own kingdoms. They cause greater problems. They're willing to make alliances with their enemies, who they were fighting the religious war against, in order to keep Byzantium from taking their recently conquered territories. This is the MO of people who are in the midst of a land grab. The other motives are there too. I don't want to suggest that this is a simple thing. There are dedicated religious people, I think misguided, who think they're fighting for the Christian faith. There are dedicated people, I don't think misguided, who realize that if Byzantium falls, this is certainly how the Hungarians were starting to think, if Byzantium falls, the battle lines are now their back door, and a defense of Byzantium is there. So there are certainly the motives that Alexios looked for, but there are the motives he didn't look for, this weird religious zeal that is foreign to the Eastern mind. And there are motives that Alexios had hoped he wouldn't see, the land grab. In other words, the Western Crusaders were everything that he had hoped the Normans would be defeated in, their seizure of Byzantine properties. So think about these things. There's a lot involved. And I want to talk more on Wednesday about the changes that have occurred in the West that made such a phenomenon as the Crusades even possible. But let's have an open and honest discussion about the Crusades, about how they're portrayed. I tend to, and so does Dr. Stanfield Johnson, we tend to avoid Hollywood portrayals of the Crusades because they're so poor from an Eastern perspective, doing justice neither to Islam or to Eastern Christianity, that it's not worth it. One more thing I want to throw out. The Crusades are often billed as Christianity going to war with Islam. Very few people at the time would have really thought this way, in spite of sermons that suggest this might have been the case. One thing I want to throw out: Christianity was mostly not found in Western Europe. At this stage of history, the majority of Christians were not Western Europeans. They were Eastern Europeans, they were Arabs, they were Persians, they were Chinese, they were Indians. The Christian presence stretched as far east as Japan. And yet, the weird cultural biases of the West, and this is a rant I share with Rosemary, see Christianity as a Western European phenomenon. If you were to take my History of Christianity course, you would be taking a course in Middle Eastern history. Think about that. Let's talk about that, and let's continue discussing what the Crusades actually were on Wednesday. Ask me whatever questions you have. I'll give you the answers I have. I'm not an expert on the Crusades, but I know more about them than anyone else on this campus. That's for darn sure. So let's talk on Wednesday.